To my left, we have Linus Sandgren. We have Oren Soffer and Christopher Probst with us tonight. So just to name a few works here with Christopher Probst, he's known for his work in Mindhunter, working with artists such as Lana Del Rey, Billie Eilish, Taylor Swift, Eminem, Ariana Grande, just to name a few. He's also the Chief Innovation Officer of Synapse Virtual Productions, which deals with shooting in the LED screen arena. I don't say much more because I don't know much about that. He will, though. And Oren Soffer, known for The Creator, most recently. Also Fixation, short films such as See You Soon, and working with brands such as Nike, BMW, Mercedes-Benz, and Grey Goose, and also HBO. And Linus Sandgren, known for works such as La La Land, Don't Look Up, Babylon, and recently Saltburn.
And what about Forrest Schultz?
Yeah, and my name's Forrest Schultz. I'm president of Atlas Lens Co. And so, thank you. So tonight, we get to talk about anamorphics and only anamorphics, okay? Just kidding. Just to start this off, the format's kind of gonna be a discussion amongst you three, just to keep it here. We're gonna get through some possibilities of like using specific examples where we can call up clips or stills. Some of that we have some media prepared, and otherwise we can look things up. We are connected to the internet, and we can follow up on some of the discussions about those clips. At some point, of course, we'll open up for a little Q&A so that any questions pertaining to shooting on anamorphic or those considerations, the audience here, you can ask those questions.
I mean, these two already started a whole sidebar lens geek out conversation, so all these people are probably, what are they talking about up there? I see hand gestures going on.
Right.
They're talking about lenses. What lenses?
A side lens conversation before the lens conversations. That's how messed up we are in our DPs are just.
Yeah, there's layers to this. There's the technical, there's the artistic, the story. I guess they're all sort of meshed together. Let's start with the top one, though. Let's say, when does a project become an anamorphic project? How does it become one?
Yeah, I mean, to me, it's like, to me, every film or every project should start like a blank page, I think. And you don't know until you read the script and figure out a mood of the film and a look together with the director from all kinds of conversations. Whether it could be obviously practical, but to me, a lens, usually, I feel like usually the lens choice is an aesthetic. It's like, it's how expressive it should be in whatever direction. There are situations where I could choose, for example, anamorphic for a technical reason, like you want to de-squeeze the image because you need to fit it. But generally, the choice of lens is always, to me, an aesthetic. You think?
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, I feel like the decision can sometimes be made quite late. Like sometimes you need to look at lenses. Yeah. You need to. Sometimes it's not obvious. Sometimes it's obvious. If you get a script and it's a Western, and you go to Utah or you go to New Mexico and you look at a widescreen vista, it can be very intuitive to feel like this film is widescreen. Yeah. Like sometimes you just have that feeling just from a script, or like science fiction, on The Creator, like that decision was very easy. That it wasn't a big conversation because it's evoking cinema. I mean, it's evoking like existing films and existing images and emotions and feelings.
I think, yeah.
So we wanted to tap into that. So it was like, oh well, we know that anamorphic is a way into it, but sometimes it's not obvious.
Yeah,
right?
I agree. I think it is really the script that dictates whether it is important or not, or like the story. And in that case, you felt like, oh, it's kind of a no-brainer. And sometimes it's more like, what does it benefit this story? Is it good that it feels more sort of, if you say like generalize, you would say it's more sort of cinematic maybe or whatever. And like as an example, actually, I was surprised when, or it was an interesting thing when I worked with Damien on La La Land, and we did that for those reasons that we wanted it to be CinemaScope, and not even just anamorphic, but like actually 255, because you can on Super 35 shoot 255 like the classic CinemaScope for the sort of nostalgia of the old Hollywood and the old movies. So we shot on old Panavision lenses for the soul of it, really. Like more than the look of it, it was really like to take the soul of it. But for the next film, which was First Man, which he wanted to feel like a documentary more. It was the wrong choice with anamorphic, we thought. You know, like it's actually like better spherical because it feels more like you're 16 mil on an 8-ton in France and you go like with a, you know, zoom. So it's always a creative, I think.
It's true that societally we have sort of a visual memory of films that we've experienced in, you know, the 100 plus years of cinema, and it does sort of influence the feelings you have that are imbued by certain films that you grew up on, have seen. Like if you think about, you know, the blockbusters that, you know, emerged in the 70s and 80s, a lot of those were filmed anamorphically. If you think about Star Wars or Indiana Jones or any sci-fi film like Alien or anything like that. So that already starts to evoke a visual memory, and that memory is tied in with a feeling. And so as you're thinking about projects, you may have touchstone films that have that sort of feel that you want to evoke. And then from a technical standpoint, when it was on film, if you wanted a widescreen aspect ratio, prior to 1982 and the popularization of Super 35, it was really a choice of am I spherical or am I anamorphic? If I want widescreen, I'm shooting anamorphic. You couldn't do a crop. With digital now, that argument is sort of negated. So you can do any sort of aspect ratio you want. So then it's like, are you choosing the lens for the properties that it has? And specifically, anamorphic has, you know, sort of characteristic faults in its system, distortion or certain signature flares if you wanted to go. So you can call upon those that also sort of trigger this sort of collective memory that we all have in films that feel sort of genre-based. For me, the casting of a lens is also really critical in terms of, especially in contrast. What is the contrast that I want to sort of imbue? Like, oftentimes it has to do with, again, imperfection, about having a creaminess or a certain nostalgia, the way it responds and will bloom when you have a bright light that could feel nostalgic or feel like a memory. And you can evoke emotions based on that optical response that's organic as part of the actual light rays going through pieces of glass. And for me, that's special, and anamorphic has that in spades.
Yeah, the First Man example is so interesting because it's anamorphic is most anamorphic lenses are stylized. Like when you make that decision, you know that you're going to imbue a film with certain optical elements that are going to be noticeable by an audience. You're going to have bokeh, you're going to have flares, you're going to have the way that depth is rendered, distortion, lens barrel distortion, and all that. So it's like, it's a commitment. You know that you are elevating visual language into something that is noticeable by an audience. And so whether you're doing it to evoke a specific memory from an audience of other films, or you're doing it to create a specific mood, it's interesting that it's a choice, because when you want to make something that feels more grounded or documentary style or naturalistic, it's like that kind of took you away from that right. choice.
No, I think with the naturalistic in mind, I would think like, just as my base go, I would think like 16 mil spherical is the most sort of poetic, naturalistic, intimate, emotionally sort of humble, or what do you say, like
grounded or
like low key and naturalistic and real. Yeah. And then on 35 you get a sharper image, so you consider that, but still spherical is a little more. And anamorphic is generally, to me, more expressive. So if you don't want it to interfere with the film in a sort of visual language that expresses and gets more sort of creative in a way, if you don't want that layer of a lens, then you're going to have to sort of really look carefully for those anamorphic, and then you could use anamorphic lenses that are very clean or much more technically.
There's something that special that happens with the anamorphic process, because you have two different sort of focal lengths combined into one lens, two different planes of focus. And when that gets mixed up into the out of focus image, there's something that happens technically that creates that elliptical bokeh, and that fall off happens gradually. And so there's a sort of disassociation with the foreground object that's in focus and then the background image, which becomes elliptically distorted out of focus, that are sort of ingrained fight or flight mechanisms is able to sort of ignore that background because it's abstracted. It's less, you know, we're constantly tracking, even, you know, primordially for some wildebeest to come charge at us out of our peripheral vision. But when that anamorphic lens distorts that background image, we can actually sort of detune our attention from that, and it relaxes, and we can actually focus more on what that subject is. And that's really an important property, because you really feel like the storytelling is standing out, and that compression that happens and that elliptical distortion is a fundamental core of the majority of anamorphics that have the cylinders based in the front of the lens. There are anamorphics that do it in the middle and in the back, or combinations of the two. So you can get an anamorphic lens that is entirely straight line, linear, no breathing, no elliptical bokeh, and it doesn't necessarily feel anamorphic. It feels spherical, and by and large, it seems to be a less popular choice because of that. If you wanted to have sort of clinical sheet metal on a car job or something, you can shoot something like the Scorpios, for example, that have all the anamorphosis happens behind the iris, so you don't have those artifacts.
Right. But I think of the films I've done, I think I've used the same lens twice, only one time, actually, except from, I mean, 2 times I used spherical primos on 2 movies, different movies, and then I used the atlases on 2 different movies, but they were actually detuned, so they didn't look the same. And on all other movies, I've actually used different lenses on every movie, and that is not because I want to use different lenses. It's because I consider it a really important part of the visuals. One is like the lighting, obviously. How stylized do you want it? Naturalistic do you want it? What film stock do you shoot on? Digital or film, or and what's the aspect ratio? But for every project, you consider lenses, obviously, kind of maybe mostly, right? But I feel like they are always important in its details, even between spherical lenses like the K35s versus Cooks or whatever. It's like always a difference. Something happens, so, and you see it when you test. So I really just test, and then, but it's interesting. But actually, to your point with the clinical, it wasn't necessarily clinical. But when we did Promised Land, we wanted to shoot that kind of ideally, that film on like VistaVision kind of, or 65 or something that reminded us of this sort of mid-century photography that happened, that was documentary-style photography in America of sort of after the war, and those references of stills was like crisp and colorful, juicy film, Kodachrome, I think it was actually, but we shot on film, but we used the Hawk 1.3 anamorphics on 35. Super 35. So we used the full negative to get as much image as possible, but we needed it to be 178 for video, but 185 for cinema. So the 133 with the 1.3 squeeze was really a choice to get as much negative on 35 as possible for the aspect ratio. So that was a technical choice. However, I love those Hawks. They looked beautiful, and they had an anamorphic feel to it, so that added something else as well, but it wasn't actually the main choice. So that's also like, sometimes I feel like that's important too, but...
There used to be a lot of considerations when you're proposing anamorphic. If we roll back the clock to certainly like 50s, 60s glass, there was limitations ascribed to that choice. Traditionally, anamorphic lenses didn't focus close, so if you had a film that was very sort of in confined spaces, and you couldn't get the camera far enough back without having to cut holes in walls and that sort of stuff, or having to use diopters, and that throws the whole scale off. And then at that era, you're also dealing with non-video tap, so you're really sort of at the mercy of the focus puller and the camera operator to get focused properly. It became problematic. So, with a trend now to also sort of resurrect vintage lenses and remount them perhaps, or ideally rehouse them, those limitations are still there in older optics, but if you rehouse, you can fix mechanical problems that exist. So I know for myself, I shoot a lot of vintage glass in general, and I own a set of vintage Kowa Anamorphics, which are really beautiful, but they're hard to maintain mechanically. The focus throws are smaller, so there's struggles to deal with on the technical side of that proposition. Also, certain lenses would fall off. You couldn't put the eyes close to the top of frame of certain anamorphics. They would blur out, or you couldn't play the periphery because of the distortion, barrel distortion. They would get stretched out. I remember even a couple shots on Endgame, they were using the ultra panatars, and at the sides of the frame, some of the characters were getting really kind of squeezed and tall and bendy, which was like, oh, okay.
Yeah, I mean, we were just talking about it outside. Like the Kowa, we use the Kowa 75 for almost the entirety of the Creator, which is a beautiful lens. But the 40 and 50, which have been kind of omnipresent as anyone who's used like the full set of Kowas, you put those lenses on and like you can't pan the camera. Because the distortion on the edges is so warped.
It looks
and
like
crazy.
a Coca-Cola bottle, kind of.
Yeah, exactly. Like you're looking through a bottle, and you can't put a person on the edge of the frame because
There is a software for it, I think, or a plugin in.
Yeah,
like,
well now you can
DaVinci or whatever. They can redo that. I think. I don't know. Someone.
Well, that would apply to us more than you, who still delve in film a lot more. It's a little trickier because if you're doing any sort of, well, I don't know, you're doing photo chemical finishes, but still, I mean, it's less sort of tolerant on that. Ironically. I did a project which was shot spherically, but wanted to feel anamorphic, and so I'm looking at Seth right now because we shot a Mindhunter on Leica lenses, and then Fincher wanted to have a 1970s C-series feel, so then he went ahead and put in massive amounts of barrel distortion, chromatic aberration on the edges of the frame, anamorphic lens flare. Why? Why not just shoot anamorphic at that point? But in terms of his workflow, he wanted to have a whole sort of look around so he can basically restabilize and pan and recompose shots on the fly, do split frames to compose people, and with a bendy, distorted, anamorphic, flary lens, that would prohibit that post-process that he's sort of famous for, creating that very omniscient, clinical, perfect framing, operating compositions. So then at the afterthought, he takes probably the most flat, perfectly controlled, non-breathing prime lens you could do, which is the Summoluxes, and then distort the hell out of them and throw flares on it and make it look like anamorphic. So at heart, he loves anamorphic. He just doesn't want to admit it.
Yeah, I mean, I just saw. I know it's pretty clear because I just saw The Killer. I don't know if you guys have seen it. Obviously, none of us shot it. You just need to find Eric Messerschmidt in the bar or something and get him down here. But it's the same thing. They shot on the Summolux, I think, and added barrel distortion, added anamorphic flares and everything. It's interesting, but it shows how much of it is aesthetic. Yeah. It shows how much of it is the aesthetics evoke a certain feeling, right, and a certain idea.
Yeah. Oh. I was pointing my finger, but not at you guys. No, I'm just kidding. I wanted to follow up with that. There's so many, it seems like there's a lot of attributes of anamorphic that you just kind of can't hide. After, the first few shots, maybe a wide shot or something, you're not still sure, but eventually the lens is going to show itself. And I've kind of sort of heard this as it's like looking at a movie through a window. And that window has a character that's sort of fixed in place. And with the advent of sort of starting with a perfect image and layering it on, you're kind of trying to recreate that window experience of looking through. But more to the technical difficulties, or the challenges, I should say. What are the considerations that you take on set when shooting anamorphic, knowing that these things might show up, and how do you pre-plan for that?
I mean, you just test. You test the lenses, you figure out what their limitations are. The main ones that'll come up is close focus and exposure. So some anamorphics are just slower than others, certainly slower than spherical lenses. So lighting comes into play. You have to consider how much light you need. And close focus is probably the big one. Is mostly vintage, older anamorphics have limits on close focus. Some of them are quite extreme. Like there's some lenses that won't close focus past 4 or 5 feet, yeah. And you have to carry a set of diopters, and then that becomes a whole pain in the ass because hate putting a diopter on, and then it limits your focus plane, and you're stuck with it, and it reduces your flexibility. But nowadays, what's so great is all these. Newer anamorphics like the Atlas Mercuries that are being designed with like certain visual elements that evoke like quote unquote vintage, what's called vintage qualities, but have modern mechanics. solve a lot of the problems. And so it's like we're in this golden age now where there's just so many more options and better close focus and better this, and Panavision will go in and they'll change anything. You know, like you bring them an old vintage set of Panavisions, you're like, hey, can we make a set of this but that it close focuses to 12 inches? And they'll do it. You know, they have the technology now to do these things. And this is over my head. Chris I don't know how any of that works, but.
I mean, I agree that that's been the limitations, like, and the focus drop off, right? Like sometimes the focus puller needs to like pull like 6 inches more on the sides of the lens than in the middle. Right. and then, but that is whether you appreciate that or not for an aesthetic, because again, I feel like the lenses have a chance to, and especially anamorphics, to sort of help with the escapistic feel of a movie. Like it's kind of that vibe, right? It's like the feeling that you're in something else. It's like an amazing just journey. And if you want to be more expressive with it, then sometimes it's cool that the drop-off is focus. Yeah. The focus drop-off is bad. But what always been an issue, I feel like, is that especially close focus has been a challenge. So, for example, Dan Sasaki at Panavision has changed, like in La La Land, he changed 40s to become like a much closer close focus, specifically for scenes where we knew we were going to have to be wide and go in on a close-up in the same shot without cutting, and that can't be done with the diopter. So, but now, like you said, like with their lenses being like 2 feet instead of 3 on all of them, right? Like kind of thing, or like most of them. But it's at least there is really good. That is great with it. But then you want to have everything. I think you want to have the ability to go more expressive in a crazy way and less. And yeah. But it's great you have the option now.
Yeah. Well, I think the point there is that it's. I always get a little crazy. I'm curious, Chris, to hear what your thoughts are on this. But when people say like, you should shoot a lens at this stop, like, oh, the Panavision C series, like. You should shoot it at a 5.6 or you should shoot it at a 4, and it's those are technical considerations that are so irrelevant, I think, to what we do, because it's so much more about aesthetic and about the emotion, exactly, and shooting vintage lenses wide open where the fall off is greater and where they are a little soft and they do have that kind of edge distortion and they do have that bit where the top and bottom blur, like that creates a feeling. And so even though those are quote-unquote technical flaws in the lens, it's ultimately like that's part of our toolkit, is to decide how much of those flaws we lean into for
totally.
aesthetic purposes,
I think it's also like, I guess, I mean, when cinema was invented, obviously everyone strived to make a better, technically better film stock, a technically better lens, better camera. Funny enough, the 2709 has been like the most steady camera ever since 1912 or whatever. But so I feel like I try to think about this, like what happened. I feel like maybe the MTV sort of anyone growing up with sort of MTV generation and later has changed sort of a little bit of mindset towards, specifically like. Lenses, maybe, actually. It's like, to me it feels like they always constantly was like perfected, always. It was like, got to get a better lens. If you were offered to shoot on 16 mil and then they said, no, we can shoot on 35, that would be better. It would be better to shoot on 65. It's like everyone would strive to get on better and better and sharper. And so when the Master Primes came out, or the Leica sphericals as well, even like 2000 something, right? Or end of the 90s to, I mean, some people here may know better, but it's like, it was actually better lenses. While now, later, we kind of look for the opposite. We sort of look for lenses, expression, right? Yeah. Especially with the digital, I guess, it's been kind of, I mean, what I can look at a film, right, and like all of us can look at a film and we feel like, oh, that's amazing. Look at the blue flares. I'm sure at the time people would like try to avoid those blue flares.
Oh yeah, I mean, all the imperfections that we're paying homage to, they were radically trying to avoid and flag off and control, and that breathing and distortion. So much so they would not have actors come close. I mean, there's the famous anamorphic mumps of the original CinemaScope lenses that prohibited close focus because they would get all jowly and stretch because of the anamorphic focusing solution. But now, in sort of the modern era, we're sort of paying tribute to those imperfections and sort of having the option to dial that in. We've gotten so advanced with anamorphics in control that you can have something that resists flare and maintains contrast very well and doesn't breathe, like master anamorphics, for example, or the Scorpios. And now we're actually getting into, like, let's tune some of that back in. Let's change the coatings. Let's change air spacings, or let's introduce filtration within the lens to make it more expressive, more responsive, and have these imperfections. I did a job with my Koas in, I was just telling Oren about this, in Colorado. I did a car job, and we had a freak cold front come through. And vintage lenses largely were cemented with a tree resin called Canada Balsam. It gets brittle and yellows over time, but it's also not very sort of thermal tolerant to changes in temperature. So we're shooting break of dawn in Colorado in the snow, and all my lenses, the glass is just constricted, but the actual coating, the actual cement did not. So all my cylinders separated. And I'm looking at my lenses, just, I'm like, ah! The director loved it. The flares were amazing. So, you know, there you go. It's like $6,000 of damage and beautiful flares. So, you know, all of them had to get re-cemented with modern UV curing epoxy, which is much more pliable to temperature changes. But there you go. You know, what was, you know, 10 years ago, some cinematographers, you know, paperweight on his desk that you couldn't haul, have a film student come and haul it to the bin to throw it away is now worth $250,000. So go figure. You know, all lenses now are applicable from the 30s and 40s to modern day, are all sort of being reapplied and retooled for those very reasons. What do they bring to the camera? Was a 1930s Cooke Speed Panchro designed to be an 8K lens? No. What will the 8K sensor do behind a blurrier, flarier, creamier lens? It will recreate all those nuances and imperfection really well. So you're grabbing all those qualities that it's having, the reactions to the light, the bloom it creates, a spread across the frame. That can get faithfully created. When it was on film and it was earlier generations, you were striving to try to maintain contrast through this entire system of IP and interneg and print and multiple generations and all those degradations that happened to image. You had to start with as much of a robust image on your negative as you could. So the strive to get more and more contrast, more and more sharpness out of the lenses was the mandate. Now that's not so much of an issue. We've lost all those sort of generational changes with a digital post flow, but also, you know, we don't need all that sharpness, and we can capture it now and use that nuance as part of our storytelling tool. So that was a real sort of eye-opener for me. It was like, wow, the look starts with the lens for me. And when it was on film, it was like, if you're a Panavision guy, you got primos. If you're an Arri guy, you got master primes or ultra primes or super speeds. And you weren't really thinking about the look that the lens brought. You're thinking about the film stock, if you're doing like bleach bypass or doing ENR or some sort of technique to muck with the image, or if you're doing cross-process and all these different techniques to affect the image in some sort of post-production, whether it was even photochemical or digital. But now it's all captured digitally, and you're able to really see what the lens brings. And it was kind of like a watershed moment, I think, for the last decade. And the market shot up because everyone realized, wow, the lenses are doing something organic and creating a mood. And now this lens, suddenly, that no one was shooting on, is like hugely popular again.
Yeah, I just to add, I've been thinking about the that transition of like when that switched a lot, because it's just a funny thing to what we talked about before about how lenses, in addition to their aesthetics, they also evoke certain feelings and memories of other films and of culture that exists. But it is funny to realize how much of that is evoking things that were probably mistakes or flaws at the time. And I remember rewatching The Taking of Pelham 1, 2, 3 and some of the other Owen Roizman anamorphic movies in the 70s. And I wonder, because obviously I've never talked to the guy, so there's people here who could probably tell us some stories. Like on a shot in the New York subway, we're shooting wide open on these crummy anamorphics that are falling apart. The background's falling apart. It's so blurry.
C-series. I think Sasaki's going to have a bone to pick with you.
And it's like, is he just like killing himself? Is he just banging his head against the wall? Like, this looks terrible. It's so broken. It's so flawed. And then we look at the film now, 40 years later, like, this looks amazing.
Oh, it is artistic. The way it creams on the lens. It is beautiful.
And I wonder that. I'm like, did they? Yeah. Was he realizing that at the time, or they were just fighting it the whole time?
No, they were struggling to get the most pristine image that they could at the time. But you're battling the medium and the technology.
Limitations of the film stock, the lighting.
I mean, I remember in the 90s. I mean, I grew up in Sweden and started in Sweden, where we didn't really have much of anamorphics. Actually, we had to take it in from London, or there was sometimes Panavision was in Gothenburg for a while. But in general, it was like you had to bring it in from abroad, or otherwise it was spherical cameras, Arri cameras, or 8-ton cameras. And I remember we shot most movies on like Super 16, and wide shots on Super 16 looked like shit. I was a focus puller. I was looking at the dailies, they're like, it's out of focus and it's 9mm. How is that possible? It's like, yeah, but it was wide open, I guess. I mean, and no one could understand, but it was actually like not really sharp, that lens, because of the 16mm and not a great lens. So it was all about, I think, that. But to me, it was like, at least for me, when I experimented, was a lot shooting music videos in the 90s, even on film, and you shot on like swing shift lenses, or you did whatever you could to make mimic Hollywood mimic stuff you've seen, or mimic, for the movie, for the commercial or music videos.
Yeah.
But it wasn't that much to choose from. So when I think about it, I think I usually picked like size super speeds over like master primes for budget reasons, right? Or for like, oh, it's nice, it's little. And it's still 1.3 and it looks sharp, but it wasn't like, where are the yellow flares, right? Like now it's like I use Kawa's Cine Promenars versus like K35s have completely opposite color palettes. And it's really interesting to me to like how that affects the image. But it definitely came, I think, later, like on the whole sort of, a little later, I think, after music videos.
Yeah, but the music video shout is interesting, though, because did you ever do stuff like...
We looked at, like, those movies, right? We looked at it and was like, oh, fucking beautiful, how out of focus it is in the background. Let's shoot wide open on those lenses, how guerrilla it looks, right? Or like, it looks so cool.
Did you ever do, because I know that in those music videos and in that heyday when it was in its peak, this was before my time, you guys were doing some crazy stuff. Did you ever do like scratching the film and baking the film in an oven and all sorts of stuff like that?
Yeah, that kind of stuff. And especially you had more film stocks to choose from. So to me, it was a lot about like you cross-process the Ektachrome, and then how that looked versus how it looks now to cross-process is different. And then you could set the scanner differently with more light output, and then whether you had overexposed it or, it's like all these things that you still can do, but we had more stocks to choose from, I think, too. Used a lot of like tobacco filter, that kind of stuff too. A lot of filtration, I think.
Yeah. It's interesting to think about how much that aesthetic in the music videos in the 90s drove like a lot of what we consider like the modern aesthetic of cinematography now, like in terms of trends, in terms of lighting, and even just this idea of wanting to muck up the image.
Right.
Like coming from that. Yeah, that's interesting.
Well,
it's ironic. I mean, the moral of the story is you kiddies got it easy comparatively, but there's such a wealth of options now, more so than ever before, not only in terms of all of the arsenal of vintage lenses, but all of the new series of glass that's coming out. For a good chunk of time, there was really only 2 manufacturers of anamorphic that you could choose from, one of which you couldn't buy, which was Panavision, and then Hawk. And then there was a smattering of sort of vintage stuff out there of questionable serviceability and functionality. But then, now we have so many more options out there. You talk about like screwing up the image. It's funny because every time I try to do my worst job, I wind up getting a nomination on something. So I have the Lana Del Rey video that's nominated for here was shot with Anamorphic, for example, and we were paying homage to film noir. But there's a component of it also, which is like, it's a movie within a movie, like Lana's making a movie and we're filming the movie. So like literally I'm in the video, which is horrendous to deal with because like I got close-ups of myself.
I'm excited for Thursday.
And I shot that stuff on myself with a Canon XL2 DV camera. So it's like trying to do like the worst job possible, then it gets nominated. And the same thing happened. You talked about like trying to like bake film and stuff with, I did a video for Muse, Knights of Sidonia, where we printed all of the negative, all of it, not even just like selects, to low-con print stock. And we just scratched that up, beat it up. And when I tried to make the video look like it was shot by a black and white cinematographer who hadn't quite figured out how to shoot in color yet in the 1970s, doing a metaphysical, chop-socky, David Carradine sort of kung fu video, but financed by Soviet bloc, like arms dealers who want to get into the film industry, and shot in Kazakhstan. So it is this completely haywire thing, and you try to do your worst work. It's again paying homage to those sort of visual memory touchstones that you have associated. So I think, aside from like thinking about like story and character and servicing the story, there is this visual lexicon that's part of ingrained in us. I always it's like a cliche image if you think about like, a couple lying in a field of wheat and they're looking up at the sun and you're shooting this it's out of focus and you feel the light. I mean, and if you have a lens that has a lot of sort of spherical aberration and the coatings don't respond, it creams and milks out. That's all organic, and you get that on film, and it's like, it feels like, you feel like it's like the organic way of doing like a sepia tone flashback, but you're not doing the sepia tone. It's just in the lens responding to light. And for me, that feels like a memory like I have of like childhood or something. So how do you evoke those emotions by using optics is like sort of the next level for me in terms of when I try to pick lenses or make lenses. I find stuff that I don't want to go and like buy a $500,000 set of lenses and shoot every project for the rest of my life on to justify buying them. I'd rather make some weird oddball one-off things and then rent the stuff that I will need. If I own lenses and they're not right for any given job, I have no problem with renting. I own 2 different sets of Anamorphics. I own Atlas Orions and I own my vintage Koas, but I shoot master anamorphics all the time. I just did the Zelmus on the Lana Del Rey video because I wanted the same sort of the Panavision vertical breathing. There's different qualities based on the optical formulas they use to create anamorphic focus. We talk about front anamorphic where it puts the cylinders up front. Well, you get those big flares and it has the oval bokeh from the iris as well as a lot of breathing associated because it's in front. So those attributes start to already influence the image. And I talked about the way that the autofocus image affects our sort of way we look and scan the image as we're watching it and how we can feel like the characters popped out. So all of that ties into it.
Oh, that's great. I was sitting here obviously thinking about something here. I got the, when you brought up, let's see, that look that you're talking about imparting with these aberrations, with all of that, with those qualities of the lenses, and the limitations that you brought up, Linus, with the like close focus being one of them in the past. It made me think, just like how kind of there's been a curve back towards degrading the image that we were just discussing, and trying to put that some sort of nostalgia maybe, or just a memory of like what cinema feels like. Maybe also some of these things like camera movements, right? We get into situations now where we can put the camera in a lot of different places that in the past we might not have done. And it kind of makes me think maybe there's a difference why I see things, movies and things being done now where they might feel different than the movies of the past based on all these considerations, focus, distance, like if they're constantly just getting close-ups, camera moves that are sort of slightly, in my brain, impossible, versus maybe in the past. Maybe there's some power, is what I'm trying to get at, is maybe there's some power in using those limitations of the past and emulating them or keeping them, continuing moving forward. I don't know what your thoughts are on that, but that was just something I had in my mind.
Yeah, but absolutely. I think it's about kind of rather maybe than nostalgic, that it's like personal, like that they have personality, the different lenses. And if you consider their personalities, and I think I totally agree with you with that, you can evoke emotional things from the past, and you think of a film or you think of a memory. But I feel like depends on what film you're doing, you may, or projects, especially like with music videos, a lot of sort of experimentation, and you want to be expressive usually, I guess. Yeah. But on a film, on a movie, maybe you just want whatever your own language that is. Say should be very subtle. The camera you shouldn't feel the camera. Then I would probably not. I would be hesitant to use anamorphic if I want the camera to be very subtle. Like, for example, so it has to do with that more in the base of it. It's like remember that whatever you choose, like you shoot on film, on 16 mil, on this, everyone that has shot a lot of digital knows that there's a difference between the digital cameras even, right? And obviously the lenses, and each of them are individually interesting for different things. So just think of what is, for me it's just, I need to think of first what I want it to feel like and how will it affect what I want it to feel like if I do this or this or this, and then you test it. And what's great now, like that you create anamorphic new lenses and other companies, but that we're getting more new lenses that has listened to the people, like about that we like sort of individual sort of personalities, I think.
Yeah, I think there's a good point to emphasize there, which is that, like, to me, tell me if you guys agree, like, every film has its own personality, and every film has its own world that you're building. And sometimes that, and not just film, by the way, commercial, music video, like any project has a world that you're building. And sometimes that world is nostalgic. Sometimes it's intentionally evoking something from the past, because it's not a shortcut. I don't want to use that word in a bad way, but it's a quick way to evoke that emotion, or an efficient way to evoke it. So again, like going back to the creator, evoking a very specific film language from the 1970s and from science fiction from the 1970s. And that informed the anamorphic lens, but it also informed, to your point, how we moved the camera. And it informed a lot of little micro decisions that we made in the film language holistically. Like, when do you push in? How do you use dolly shots? How do you create evolving blocking, like Spielberg-style evolving blocking shots, and minimize coverage and that kind of thing, and have the camera constantly moving? That's a very 70s thing, specifically in science fiction and in that kind of stylized storytelling. But we also did stuff like we wouldn't stabilize our push-ins. We wanted the push-ins to be shaky, because when you go back and watch those films, like, the dollies are never smooth, and they always have that little shake, and or the operating is a little wonky, like it's not perfect. Mm-hmm. You land on a frame and there's a little wobble, and we loved that stuff. So, like, we set up the whole film to be able to tap into those things. And then this goes into another point, which is something you mentioned, which is the logistics are also important, and an important consideration. And so, like, obviously we shot the film on this tiny camera that freed up all this motion, all this freedom to move. But another consideration was the size and weight of the lens. Like, that was also a factor. Yeah. We needed a lightweight lens. Yeah. And so we had the Kowa 75, which is quite light relatively, and we had the Mercury prototype 42, which is a teeny tiny lightweight little baby lens.
Shout out to Atlas.
Yeah, there you go. That's why we're here. No, but it's interesting, and I mean, going back to even what you guys were saying with music videos, cross-processing, tobacco filters, like all of that stuff. It's interesting to me because, to me now, having come up in the digital world, like when I came up, I was shooting on 5Ds and that kind of thing. That was my entry into it. Lenses became the way to get that look, and to the point where now this is also a logistical consideration. But, like, I don't like shooting with any filters. And on the Creator, we didn't have a matte box. We just had the lens, and we had a variable ND in the front just to control exposure. But don't like diffusion filters, don't like tobacco, don't like color filters, because it's like, find a lens that does that, because we have so many options now, and all the lenses have those characteristics in it. You want blooming highlights? There's a lens for that. Or you can go to Dan Sasaki, and he can make a lens for that. He can dial in the specific, you guys can dial in the specific type of, the level of bloom.
Run, Forrest, run.
On occasion.
The whole room is going to line up later and be like, wait, you can do that?
I don't know, Linus, does maybe tell the room about your...
We did, yeah. So I used the Atlas. I used Atlas on a commercial, and I found them lively and beautiful flares. Like, I thought they were interesting, and then I thought, like, oh my God, they're so sharp to the edges, and they have a very short close focus and a T2, and to say something that is happening on the lenses generally, right? It's like the more you open them, the more they get like the color aberrations and stuff. And in this case, I felt like T2 was actually looked great, because they were like, had the sort of halations and colorations that was sort of problematic 50 years ago, but at this point, I feel like that was nice, but not for Don't Look Up. So when we did Don't Look Up, we used them, but at 2.8 or 5.6 outside, maybe 2.8 usually. And usually I shoot on 2.8 on Anamorphics just because I shoot on film, and at T2 it could become a problem sometimes, like, you know. But I have very good focus puller, George Sanchez, always on these movies. So on Babylon, I felt like I love the technicality of this lens, like that is actually has a great sharpness to the edges. You can shoot anamorphic scope, see someone in the very right frame, and he's still sharp. And so for Babylon, I asked Forrest if we could do something, and he, what did you polished the interiors with the.
They're showing your clips right down too, so just so you're aware.
That's an interior.
The party scene.
Okay.
Well, you continue, please. Yeah.
Well, so on this one, because this film had, I mean, the idea with it was that it was obviously about Hollywood and about filmmaking, and we really wanted it to feel like an epic, or Damien really wanted it to feel like an epic film about civilization, like that kind of level of epicness, and at the same time very punk, right? So with it being very, very punky, we wanted to overexpose like this is overexposed extremely, but it's still sharp to the edges, but you still get the bloominess in especially in certain contrasty situations when the highlights are really bright and the blacks are black, and you get this bloominess that happened on the old lenses sometimes if they had been scratched from being thrown around. And so Forrest solved that by going inside of the lens and screwing them up basically, but with some sort of powder, right? Like
a cerium oxide paste, essentially, that we depolished and you know,
polished the lenses.
Took off, put some aging into it, essentially, right. And tried to make them look a lot like some vintage optics we were comparing to, so that they would get, so Linus could get more of that halation.
Note the panicked first AC there, you know.
Yeah. The AD is Spike Jonze. Yeah.
Yeah. George didn't like it at first. He was kind of dubious about it, but then once we saw the look, I think it started to land.
So this film is outside. We shot at T4, but on all interior nights they're actually T2, like wide open. Plus that it's film stock and it's push processed one stop, and like a shot like those exteriors are overexposed, like a lot, but. The point is that why? Well, because we wanted it to be more expressive than, for example, Don't Look Up, that was more slick kind of look, right? So it's sort of that's so useful, I think, too. It's really important that you can do.
The other aspect of anamorphic in general is the aspect ratio, right? Is that we have this 2:3:9 palette, right, to compose on, and if you look at some sort of classic 70s stuff like Sidney Lumet films, that like they really play framing and stacking compositions and sort of the staging of the camera. Even if it were a lock-off, there's one of my favorite films from Tony Gilroy, Michael Clayton. There's a commentary on the DVD that he talk about like paying homage to that sort of 70s staging and really playing the extremes of the frame and having a character in the background and you're focused on the foreground and really sort of using the width of the format to its maximum. So that's a big part of also like why you would go down the road of a choice of an anamorphic. Certainly you can do the same thing with a Super 35, but not with the same characteristics of the compression that happen and the different focal length. So it changes the way that you can frame and compose based on that larger vertical format focal length versus the wide. So you're getting a little bit of the both lenses at the same time, which is interesting, and
you get the double.
Yeah, and it's sort of a lost art in terms of like really sort of thinking about staging and how the camera relates to the character and performance. If you watch even like John Ford films and John Huston films and stuff, like the way the camera and the actors are moving, it's like all these multi-point, and they're doing it all on like dolly position A to B to C, and they moving around the room, and it's like your master turns in your close up and your wide. And like it's actually really elegant, and I think there's a few practitioners that do that. If you think about like Scorsese or Spielberg, but a lot of times, if it's relegated toward sort of shot farming for editorial and not really making a distinct statement, that becomes like the producer's like safeguard, like, oh, we can just chop it up any which way, so just hose it down, versus really telling a story. And I think Anamorphic as a choice, it already sort of is guiding you in that way and being a little bit more classical, because you know the guys that came out of theater were really playing with the dynamics of staging and telling the story visually, and I miss that. Like when I get with the directors that really want to get into like thinking about blocking.
Gotta find better directors, man.
That's fun, you know.
It comes down to the director, doesn't it?
No,
Who
but I
thinks
mean,
about blocking
obviously, I mean the blocking. I mean, the blocking is its own thing. I mean, you can block in 1-3-3-2 and have that. I mean, they did that in the 20s and 30s too in 1-3-3. I think, but obviously with a wider screen, you can create, have more people and do, and it makes a difference. Obviously, it does look different. So I agree, it's really important. And but the blocking, obviously, the blocking and the lighting and all of that, everyone, I mean, it's really important to think of everything for the storytelling because it affects you wherever you have it. And I agree, I love to think economical that way in how you tell the story, like Bertolucci and Storaro did as well a lot, that kind of composition. But it's funny too to think about, sometimes you think of a film and I remember it as an anamorphic film and then it wasn't. Yeah. Isn't that weird? Yeah. Like,
which one?
Well, I thought of like The Conformist. I thought it was 240, and then I looked at no, it's 185. Yeah. It may even be 166.
It might be 160. Yeah.
But it's all because the composition is so specific, and usually you think of 240 films being composed that kind of way. I think in my head, I guess when I think of it.
Yeah. And by the way, go to shotdeck.com and look up High and Low, Kurosawa film. Just one of the best uses of widescreen compositions and blocking of characters.
Insane case study of like using that format to its maximum, like like the stacking of different things.
And what lens was that on?
A lot of those were Franscope, and like the early sort of Japanese anamorphic films were using a lot of French anamorphics they're bringing in, like dialyscopes and stuff like that. And then eventually they started making their own anamorphics, like Nippon scopes and cinemascopes. And there was a NAC also was a big contributor in the early generation of anamorphics in Japan that evolved also into the Kowas. They co-developed off of their sort of cylinder design, which is actually pretty fascinating and kind of hard to tap into. I had one guy in Japan who was going into like technical libraries and pulling out the trade journals from the 50s and getting all the ads for the, and talking to some of the original engineers who were in their 90s who were creating the anamorphics in Japan, which was like incredible resource. Like, oh my God, this is nuts. Like, this is information that would literally disappear. And when I was writing the book, there's like a number of people who, like, by the time I had the thought to interview them, they died the year before. I was like, oh. So, you know, it's fascinating because it still informs what we do. Even like, I'm fairly nerdy on the technical side of things, and like understanding how a lens works or how a digital camera, like ones and zeros, processes and digitally encodes something is fairly geeky. But I don't walk around the set like a robot thinking of ones and zeros. I think I want to move people, I want to make people cry, or I want to evoke an emotion. So all that sort of fades into the background of my mind, but it informs the choices. And I have this sort of Rolodex in my mind I can call out to, like if I'm trying to create a certain effect, I know how to achieve it technically, therefore I can apply it. So that's how my brain works. I have to break it down into components and then figure out how I can apply it.
Yeah. To move, Oren, you had mentioned a clip. Maybe I think we can get them to pull that up, but we're gonna, let's cue up maybe some special shots that you helped provide to us from the creator, just to speak a little bit more to the kind of that callback to some of the previous filmmaking of the 70s.
Yeah, you'll see it exactly. You'll see the film language in the clips, but also look at we'll see what we put up. Yeah, I mean this one's good because you already start to get a lot of. So we shot the whole film wide open, and so these lenses go to a 2.8, and actually some of them go to like a 2.3. But
40-50 or 2.3.
Yeah.
The 75 is a 2.8, and then the 100 is a 3.5.
exactly. So we were at a 2, and pretty much everything you see here is the 75 Koa. But to us, well, there's two interesting things to point out. One is the aspect ratio, because we did 2.76, and that's a technical result of shooting on the FX3. 16:9 sensor. Yeah. When you put a 2 times anamorphic on it, it actually de-squeezes to 3.5 to 1, which is awesome. And if we had guts, we would have released the film like that. Gareth really loved it. The director loved it. But there's a few music videos that were shot in like 3.5. It was like back in the Red 1 days, the 16:9 sensor, and you put some anamorphics on it, and you got that widescreen. Anyway, we compromised on 2.76 because it's a legacy aspect ratio.
Yeah.
It was it's the CinemaScope.
Yeah, Ben-Hur.
Ben-Hur. So we cropped off the sides quite a bit. But you can see all the characteristics. I mean, to us, it was what you were talking about before about how anamorphic, the way it renders depth, like really isolates character, was really resonant. Because that was a big thing for us. It was like every image, we wanted to have that pop. Like Gareth would call it the squint test. Have you ever encountered this concept? Like, where if you just look at the image, you look at your tap or you look at your monitor, and you just blur your vision a little bit, and you're like, can I still make out the image? Like, can I still understand what's the subject, what's the background? Like, do I still see? And part of that's lighting. Part of it is sculpting with lighting.
For lighting.
Yeah, but we the lensing also was a big component for us because of how it separates foreground and background like really well. And yeah, some of these shots are the Mercury 42. That one's Mercury. So you can tell because the bokeh is a bit different shape, but we used that when we needed a wider focal length. So inside the car, so obviously a tight space. So the 75, it's a real car on a street. There's no cheating here. We didn't take off any doors. So in order to get the camera in there, we needed the 42. And like all these interiors are 42. You can tell.
Prototype, right? The early model.
It's the sensor size.
It's the prototype. So it's a 4K sensor, 4.2K, 40
millimeters.
Yeah. It's quote unquote full frame, but it's 16:9. So it's the width of I don't know the millimeters offhand.
Oh,
so
gotcha,
Sony
gotcha.
will kill me.
So
But
it's like an LF kind of thing.
it's like an LF sensor, but it's 16:9. And actually, the Mercuries work really well with it because it's a 1.5 D squeeze.
Yeah.
So actually, the Mercuries.
The Kawas covered it.
The Cows covered it. Yeah, well, the 75 covered it,
Oh, okay.
and the 100.
Oh, gotcha.
The wider ones, I think, vignetted a little.
Yeah.
But the Mercury is great because it de-squeezes to 240 from a 16:9 sensor. So it's a perfect example of like we were talking about before with covering, like using the full width of your film stock or using the full width of your sensor. It's the same thing. So sometimes that's a consideration. But for us, it was all aesthetics. There were no technical considerations there. But yeah, the other thing that I wanted to mention was that something about anamorphic that we had talked about on the shoot was, even though it's stylized, like we talked about how it evokes cinema and it flares, the bokeh, the depth rendering, those are all elements that are not, those don't parallel human vision at all. Like that's not how we see the world. However, there's something about anamorphic that does evoke human vision to us. And there was something about the blur on the top, because human vision is not sharp edge to edge. Like human vision is focused on the center, and then the edges blur in this kind of peripheral vision. And it's not possible to really replicate it on cinema because we don't see in a rectangle. We see in like a blurring circle. But there's something about anamorphic, wide open, having the edges blur, the top and bottom have that blur, and the way it renders depth and the way it focuses on the subject and on the character that's in front of you, that creates the feeling of human vision. And it's not trying to recreate it. It's trying to create the feeling of being there, of creating something that feels real, you know, like that feels present. That's what we were after.
But it's two different things, because it's like what you refer to is right, but real, if you think of like, then in that case, a digital video, like a video camera as its purest, like a digibeta, is, I mean, in one way, much more like exactly how it kind of looks than film, but the film and anamorphic lenses and these things are humifying. It's sort of humanizing it.
It's contradictory.
It's humanizing it in a way, because I think you cannot watch something and feel emotion if it doesn't look impressionistic. It needs to be an impression of reality. It can't be like actual reality, because if it's a photocopy, there's nothing human about it. So somehow it's like weird, because your eyes don't.
So you're not a fan of high frame rate then? Have you looked at that?
I think what happens with a high frame rate is that you get another type of immersive feeling, which may be that you actually feel present, right? If you're in a 3D environment and it's 120 frames, I can totally see. I haven't seen that, except that I've sneak peeked on
for a theme park ride. It's pretty good.
But what I mean is, like, if you actually say you have goggles and it's like super high frame rate and you can't see that there's pixels in front of you, then I think you could definitely have a super impactful visual experience from that, which may be super good for certain things. Like, you really want to feel like you're there. But I feel like what we're striving for generally is some sort of impression of reality that helps convey emotions, and the emotions come with expressive things. It's like art. You don't want to see a painting that looks like, like a normal. I mean,
Oren, can I just say to your point, what I was getting at was that it's kind of like you're describing the viewport in which the framing happens, and the human vision can be sort of emulated by those edges in the frame, and combining with what you're saying, I see it as you're talking about the being present, being there, seeing it as it was, and I think about it more like it's the ideal version that we remember. It's almost like that's what's captured, and that there's something magical about that. Is like we idealize things as humans. Our emotions. You look back, and maybe the memory you had about something, how it made you feel. If you look back and revisited that day, maybe it wouldn't be so romantic or beautiful or something so moving. But
don't trust anybody. Everyone, unreliable narrators, all of them. It's the same reason why I use like lots of atmosphere and stuff, because it's like if I just plunk the camera down and it just feels like exactly as my eyeballs, it's like. Well, I'm already looking at that with my eye. I need to imbue it with something that takes it to some other place, and that's part of it. Is like the lens choice, maybe using haze that's reacting with light. So because as much as I can do, that's something physical and tangible, like putting atmosphere in the air. That's. Actually, funny. It's a good segue because with like visual effects, and they can't use any sort of atmosphere or anything like that. And you're like, but it's part of the storytelling. It's reacting to the light in the air, and then the optics are reacting to that bloom that's in the air. So I've been delving into virtual production for the last couple of years, and so suddenly not being on a blue screen or green screen and actually doing it in camera, I'm using massive amounts of smoke on set. One of the struggles with virtual production is maintaining contrast on the panels so that it doesn't give the gag away. So I've sort of interspersed some BTS and stuff, but this is shot anamorphic, and the point I'm bringing this clip up is that because for the very same reasons I talk about how like the out of focus image is sort of detuned and you're not paying attention to it, anamorphic does wonders in terms of adding those properties to the cinematographic sleight of hand that we're trying to do, and say that this wall that's 10 feet behind him is supposed to represent 300 feet or to infinity, but it's actually right there. So the physics of the depth of field, the fall off, is actually bogus. Now you could try to get in and have the depth of field skewed in the virtual, and a little bit goes a long way. So it's like it could just turn into a big blur mess, and that also feels bogus to your eye.
Not quite there yet.
Yeah. So, but you're getting depth of field by a function of the lens stop anyway, because you're focusing on the foreground. But basically doing the composites in camera and sort of seeing that live, it brings the control back to the cinematographer. So like this was a combination of Atlas Orions, and then for some of the handheld stuff, I had the Koas on, which was largely the 75, coincidentally enough. But doing this sort of scale on a sort of a fraction of the budget, and achieving those sort of results. We did a case study comparatively. I did a video for Billie Eilish where she's a fallen angel and she falls into this like black tar pit and emerges and the world erupts in fire, like this big hellscape. And we did it for real. We were in a parking lot outside of downtown Los Angeles. We had to shoot it at night. We plumbed the entire parking lot for fire everywhere. We had an old guy on a valve that had a big propane truck that ran out of propane halfway through the night. The wind was blowing the smoke out of it. I had to have big condors to light a football field area and to combat with the bright fire that we were erupting to that f-stop. And it was really problematic, and the sky up it was just pitch black. Versus here we have perpetual like, you know, a post-apocalyptic gloom going on with skyscrapers that are in rubble and burning in the background that were all under my control. And so like people think of cinematographers of having God complexes, but in virtual production, I am God. You know, it's like put the sun exactly there and the planet's not going to rotate for as long as I want it to. So, you know, you're able to sort of harness this controllability and bringing composition, lighting, framing back to the director and the cinematographer and doing your visual effects in camera and doing those comps live. And it means that, you know, you're not having to add another line budget. If you want to add a shot on blue screen, well, that shot has to get tracked, rotoed, composited. Suddenly your post supervisor is saying, no, you can't do any more shots. We're not budgeted for this. When you create the environments in virtual, you can shoot whatever you want and keep hosing it down. It's not, you've created the environment once, now you're just like on any other location you're composing. So Anamorphic for me has been a really good component to employ in sort of, especially in the sort of the early days of this, is getting up to photorealism with it. You can get away with quite a bit, like even using truly video game assets, not actual photographic elements, but CG environments that are driven by the video game engine. They can look a little gamey, and but you can get away with quite a bit. If it's a nighttime exterior and it's all built in the video game and you're inside a car and you're having an autofocus building and traffic lights, 100% believable. Then you start to try to get to like daylight work, and that becomes a little bit more problematic to make convincing. But as the photorealism goes up, if you're actually using photographic elements, that's great. So like now we're actually bringing in like sky domes that are actual photography, and there's a whole repository of assets you could bring in. So like the Anamorphic is like that final like icing on the cake for me to like tie all that together in camera, that compositing happening, because a little bit of haze in the air that's reacting to the blooming of the light from the panel is reacting organically on set. I'm leveraging that to create the believability of it tying in with the environment. And then the lens is doing the same. It's reacting to that bloom. So if you get an expressive anamorphic and atmosphere in the air and a hot spot on the panel, all of a sudden it's all homogenized in camera. So I brought that clip as sort of a counterpoint to like doing everything live and shooting on film. Is like, okay, let's take it the other extreme. Let's do it completely synthetic. Let's be on a bogus big TV wall behind us. And what does that do with Anamorphic? So,
but just a sidebar on the volume, because when we did First Man, that was the whole idea of creating volume, was to shoot it all in camera. And we wanted the interior of the cockpits to be on 16mm for the quality of the intimacy of the sort of poeticness or sort of closeness to the characters. And we did test in IMAX, we did test in 35, and the studio wanted us to shoot in 35 because it was a bigger budget movie. They didn't want it to be like 16, but when they saw the test, even the studio felt like, fuck, that's how it has to look. It has to look like real. And the reason we sort of created the volume for that, which was a 180 LED screen, we made it so that it was 30 feet away from the camera, because on the lens, right, you have from 30 feet to infinity is very little, but if it came too close to camera, you got like the sense that, because the producers were like, why don't we just put the LEDs right outside the window, because the depth of field will be wrong. And to your point then, shooting anamorphic helps obviously, or 65 would help because you get a shallower depth of field, so it's harder to see the problem with it. But if you're in a cockpit at like 1 foot from the face of a guy and then you rack to the Earth surface, it needed to be sort of realistic in our film. And it's, I agree with you, it's like a great illusion. And ironically, if you watch First Man in the dailies, the producer told me like as well, he was like, I'm so sad actually this film is released not like the dailies looks, because it's like 95% there. It's like we didn't use any blue screen, and it's all visual effects in pre-production that we extended to other usage too, because we were thinking like tracking up along the rocket for creating elements to sort of get them in an elevator up the Apollo 11. But instead, I was like, why don't we just shoot actually the plate in Cape Canaveral, and then we do like a CG rocket. So, I mean, I feel also like, of course, the CG rocket is perfect if it's out there 30 feet away and you're in a shaky elevator, and we shoot it on 16 millimeter as we go up the rocket, and we can rack to it and back, and the production designer put down like beams in between and smoke and shit outside. And it really looks that way in camera, and you can put other layers and stuff. So, but my recommendation is to have like as deep volume as possible, but the limit is obviously the ceiling. So,
Let me just say that film was jaw-dropping for me, especially like when you start to cut to the wides and like the lunar whole sequence is just like, oh my god, just like heart skips a beat when you just, and with the score too is really like that whole poetic moment there is just really inspiring.
But it was also like we did choices like that, like where you want to go from 16 mil, and then as you come out on the moon, you want it to be as clear and sharp, and sort of you want to see how empty it is. So then you go IMAX, and that kind of thing is so important, and that's where I feel like in that comparison, that is sort of like much more naturalistic, and then there's naturalistic films in Anamorphic too, but you make your choices for emotional reasons, I think.
Did they show the clip from? I wasn't paying attention because I don't have eyes in the top of my head. Yeah. The final clip from the creator with the tentacle creature.
Is that a daylight exterior? Or
No.
I think they're going to bring it up because we're talking about it now.
Yeah, it's on a. Let me see if this one? Okay, so just to your point, this is on the volume, and it's everything you mentioned. It's anamorphic, wide open, atmosphere, like handheld, gritty, very little disregard for VFX. But they were on board with what we were doing. Like there wasn't any pushback because this was designed, and so for close-ups, all the close-ups you're getting in-camera finals, which is really helpful. Wide shots, they're replacing the environment. Like this shot is replaced because you see the edges of the volume. Like you just see the end, the wall. You see the floor. But 95% of it is there, and it's exactly what you said. It's like this, it's just the perfect interplay of in-camera lighting coming from the wall, interacting with the anamorphic, interacting with the atmosphere, and it just creates the illusion. And to your point, Linus, that there's this trend. Have you guys seen this trend where there's people that hand draw like photorealistic replications of photographs, and then you zoom in and you're like, oh, this was done with a pencil.
Yeah.
And it's amazing. And they're like, this took me 90,000 hours or something to complete. But then you look at the whole thing and you're like, okay, why? It just looks like a photograph. Yeah. Like when you look at it from afar. It's a very impressive technical feat. Yeah. But what does it actually evoke in terms of emotion? Right. There's nothing impressionistic about it. There's nothing subjective about it. And that's what cinema is, and that's what Anamorphic does, and that's what film stock does, and that's what, like, all this stuff that we do is to create that impression of reality. We're not trying to recreate reality. And just to go all the way back to high frame rate and stuff, that was the issue with it for me, is it's creating reality. It's too real. That it doesn't feel impressionistic. It feels like you're just on a set looking at an actor wearing prosthetics and makeup and acting, and you're like, but that's not what I want. I want to.
It pulls you back to reality.
I want to be immersed. Exactly.
I think it's sort of exactly the opposite from the charm of sort of the aesthetics of the filmic, whatever. But I know there's a point that. Ang Lee did when he did his 120 frames. He didn't want to recreate. He feels like, why don't we push the limits towards what digital can give us instead of trying to make digital look like film? Why don't we shoot on film if we want to do film? He loves film. Yeah. He just feels like, let's try something else. And the only way to see it is actually in that frame rate too. And I haven't been able to actually see it in that frame rate. So I can't tell. But I think it's just an interesting concept. And I think it comes with those new sort of things that for video game and stuff, I think it's going to be more and more sort of immersive that way instead of. It's going to be more and more photoreal. It feels like, to me, that's what they strive for. I'm
sure the visual language of the way that younger generations who've come up on from television then to video games and TVs that automatically have a higher frame rate plugged, so that if you don't know how to turn it off, you get used to that. And so I think visual response is going to be evolving with the generational gap. Like, we cannot tolerate, like, we got to look at a 24 frame flickery playback.
I think it's two different things. Yeah, I think anytime you want to be sort of emotionally moved, it's one thing, but the other one is like, if you want to experience that you're inside this war game, right? It's like, then it feels much more maybe Maybe, I don't know. But for films, I wouldn't think it's better.
No.
Personally.
I'm curious, Forrest, do you think we should like open up to questions to see how this conversation, because I would like to interact with
we're on the
everybody
same page, I think
and sort
that-
of,
I think
my
that
whole
time-
dread with any sort of like panel discussion is when I'm sitting in the audience and I walk out and I didn't learn one thing. And I'm like, that was a waste of my time. So I always want to try to give
We're
as
good on
much
time still,
like
so let's do
technical
that.
points or tips or tools of the trade.
Yeah.
So like if we want to open this up to questions and any sort of regard to that, either aesthetic or technical or
Yeah. Are there lights up on the audience too? Just
yeah, they fade them
see?
up when they do questions. So
Yeah, I want to make sure we keep track, and then if we can get microphones to people, we'd love to start that because that's
There we go.
exactly
Now we can
right.
see everyone's faces.
It's that time of the eve.
We'll share.
Okay. Question over here.
we'll get to everybody.
We'll get to every. Hi.
Hi. So we're in a great age of all these new lenses, a lot of anamorphics especially, but we haven't seen a lot of anamorphic zooms. I'm wondering if you guys have any, I don't know, look forward as to what's coming in the zoom direction.
That's something that we are looking at. That's for sure. I guess that's my question.
And a fast zoom, T2.
And is this something that
yeah,
you guys
yeah.
as
And
DPs
with
are interested
really
in?
good close
Yeah,
focus.
a 0.95 zoom
And minimal
coming soon.
breathing.
So, yeah.
Yeah, we definitely are looking at
And
the,
small and lightweight.
Yeah, yeah. 4
Front
inches,
element,
5
yeah.
inch, really pocket size.
Yeah, Hawk and Panavision would take umbrage with your comment because they do have a series of good anamorphic zooms that are options as well.
It's an important thing. It's something we've been asked for a very long time, and just to give some background, not to steal too much time, but we're working through learning every time we do something, right? With the Orions, we learn a lot about what these lenses do, and Mercury, we learn a lot about how that's received, and did we move into something that's meaningful. Every time we try to come out with something, there has to be sort of a meaning behind it, and it's a very personal thing. Kind of going back to that, we're creating these lenses that are personal to us because myself and co-founder Dan and all of us at Atlas Lens Co, the whole team, there are things that we respond to, and it would be wrong if we don't respond to it and keep moving forward. So we really study these things out, and Zoom is on the mind. So yes, that's all I'll say.
But that's the thing too, actually, like you said, now I think many people who make lenses now think of it more like what they want to do for a personal reason. Then that is like, how can we make this technically better or whatever. It's more like from what you feel is like great for your kind of characteristics in your lens.
Right, because when we started, there's so many options already that are leaning into that technical perfection category. So by choosing anamorphic and by choosing not only anamorphic, but striving to kind of pull back onto these older optimization techniques or looking back into older lens design and trying to play within those limitations. I think there's something to be said about that. There's no A-spheres in the current Orion and no A-spheres in the Mercuries. And there's A-sphere is an older technology, but we just chose to use that as a limitation to test where does the image want to go, and it sometimes provides a more classical, in quotes, answer to what you get, and yeah.
Shoot.
Who else?
Thank you for doing this, by the way. It's very awesome, and to see that there's other people that are as obsessed with lenses. But I had a question. I've worked with some directors that are maybe less technically versed or specific with their requests with lenses, and I'm curious if you guys have worked on projects where your collaborators maybe had conflicting taste with what you wanted to propose, and also at what point you involve specific directors that might not be as specific with the request into the lens choice.
I can just say, if I may, that I don't want to tell the director what lens we should use to begin with, because I don't want to, it's not like I like this. The reason we choose a lens is because it comes from the script and then the vision of director and what they want to convey, what kind of feeling. If they're into like some sort of emotional sort of escapade, like, you know, you could tell in the discussions, oh, and you think as a smart cinematographer who knows more about lenses, feels like he's gonna or she's gonna wanna have something anamorphic probably, and see how clean and dirty, do you like it to be very like, you know, like I kind of wanna work with the director in a way where the director's vision, whether it is outspoken or not, but they may not even know themselves, but you in the discussions get to the conclusion, this will be the best for you, right? It's like you're, that's how I approach every director. It's like always important that we're making the film the director wants, but they may not know it. But so then you start to propose, like, so see, I'm going to do a camera test, and then we look at it together and judge, you know, together. And then you could be like, but I really wish the lens was much lighter because it's all handheld or whatever. So, you know, and you guide it in the direction. And I feel like I kind of always made the choices eventually, but they agreed. So it was like, we agreed. We came to the conclusion always, I think. Like,
yeah, the loneliest experience for me as a cinematographer, even being sort of like a major technophile, and you would think I would want to dominate all of the visual aspects of it, is having a director who had no opinion on the visuals and say, oh, just do whatever you want. Well, that's the least inspiring for me. I like to be challenged into different ways. So the more visual the director, the better the engagement is for me. It's like we're creating something together. We're coming up with new ideas. Maybe pushing me out of my comfort zone and doing something differently that I would fall back on. So I respond to the most visual directors who want to really have an opinion and craft and talk about the focal length, the camera placement, the angle of the flare, or whatever it is. It's like, yes, like let bring it. Like if it's just say, oh, give me some of your magic, it's like that's boring, and that's just like it's just me like riffing on myself.
A quick example was actually where when I worked with David Russell on American Hustle. It was the first film I did with him, but we kind of felt the 70s, we felt it wanted to be 240, we felt it wanted to be anamorphic actually. And the only thing is, like in all those discussions, you come to other compromises, like he doesn't like to be compromised with, for example, shooting for only 4 minutes on a Steadicam because it's a 400-foot mag. So I figure like he's gonna wanna have like a longer, because they started to talk digital, and I was like, that's not as good as shooting on film in this case, I thought. And perhaps if we shoot 2perf spherical, you get a 240 image. It's a compromised anamorphic. It's not anamorphic look, but still it's 240. And we started to discuss it. Like actually, when you think about it, it's kind of a guerrilla style cinematic. You know, like it's a little more like as if you're not completely, fully sort of Hollywood rich, but a little more sort of gritty, and I love 2perf for that reason. That is actually quite gritty and still 240 or even wider natively. But the point is, it became a compromise on the lens for the need of other things like you know, film shooting time or flexibility of, we had to be on Steadicam as well and stuff like that. So
ironically, look at all your you know, spaghetti westerns that in your mind are anamorphic. Largely, they are 2perf Techniscope. If you talk about Sergio Leone and all those things, so you know, grain was a thing that was a component of that because they were blowing it up from you know, a very smaller negative compared to anamorphic. But it's funny, but yeah, it's
because they were more about the widescreen of it all, so that's why they created the anamorphic lens in order to get it widescreen. It wasn't about getting bokeh. That was a by effect, right? But yeah.
Yeah, I think the big thing is testing. Right, it's you as the DP have the knowledge base of what lenses are out there and what they look like and what they feel like and what they evoke. And so I think that's well, first and foremost, I agree. I don't think it's the DP's job to say, I think it should look like this, right? So if there's a disconnect between how you interpret the script and the emotions of it and how the director's interpreting the script and the emotions, that's a conversation you need to have, not about lenses. Like that's a bigger conversation about the project. And once you've found the shared language and the shared understanding of the script and of the emotion of what it needs, then it's really your job as the DP to like provide options and say, hi director, you're maybe not tech savvy, you don't know all the options. Let me do a show and tell. Come into the rental house. Let me show you all these lenses. Let me show you all these different things. Let's find what you like, because they might not know. and you know better what's out there and what's available. But ultimately, it is a director's medium. You know, if you want to choose your own lenses and vision, that's what still photography is for. You can do it yourself.
More questions?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, hello. I'm here.
Point or raise your arm. I can't see.
Yeah.
Oh, there you are.
Yeah.
Oh, we are. Okay. Okay. We'll get all. Go ahead. We're gonna rapid fire.
Yeah. My question is if you've ever been in a situation when during pre-production you were sure that this anamorphic set is perfect for this project, or this spherical set is perfect for this project, and then on an actual set, sitting in front of the monitor, I don't know, the first, the second, the third day, you said, shit, it was better to choose a spheric set or an anamorphic.
That's happened to me. We were talking outside about the not to throw any specific lens under the bus, but I shot a film with the Vantage ones, the spherical lenses, and we shot. It was a hybrid Hawk anamorphics and spherical, and we didn't have a ton of time to test. It was an indie film, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All these limitations and excuses on myself, but the Vantage ones didn't perform the way that we thought they would. So we sort of thought they're all a T1, and we thought, oh, we'll shoot the whole thing wide open on T1. We want that super shallow depth of field. It's going to be great. And then we didn't have much time to test them, so on set we put them on, and suddenly you realize, like, oh, you know what? These lenses actually don't really look good at a T1.
Well, they look good for certain things.
For certain things, yeah. A dream
I have a
sequence,
story about that
perhaps,
too.
or something
We
very
did
subjective, but yeah.
I did a Britney Spears video, and we had an intermix of K35s, and I thought, oh, I want to get these new T1s, right, and we'll shoot them at the night work, and because they open to a T1, they have a lot of spherical aberration, which creates bloomy creaminess to it, right? And at night, it was a gauze bomb. It was like too much. We had neon signage in the background and streets and stuff, and it was way too much. So then we wound up using the K35s of that. However, in the desert daylight work, I opened it up to a T1, and it was fucking magic. It was like, oh my God.
Looked like
so
really
you get a T1 lens, and you shoot it in the desert at high light, but you don't do it at nighttime when you get a gauze bomb. And so it's kind of ironic. But again, casting the right lens for the right look. I mean, the desert work at T1 was incredible.
Yeah, and testing, which we didn't really get to do. That was the problem.
And then, like you have done on those projects too, I do that oftentimes too, that I have actually more than one type of set of lenses. Not that I rather actually have one set of lenses and then not too similar, but like the other one is different somehow. So sometimes I've had, like, didn't we have on Babylon? I think we had the one that was sort of tuned, the customized, but we also had Todios. We had Todios, and for other types of even more extreme, and also I think didn't we also have a sort of an untuned version, or maybe I
had like a prototype of the 25.
Oh, the 25
it hadn't come out yet. Yeah.
Yeah, right. But no, I've had mishaps, like kind of like where we had issues with focus, but more because we used a lens that had a very short throw. I mean, the focus was a quarter of the lens, so it was more complicated for the focus puller. More like that kind of thing. Why I changed.
Yeah. I just was informed.
It's the 35K 35 you're talking about right now, the notorious like 40
it was
degree
on American
rotation.
Hustle, yeah. Steadicam K35.
That lens
wide
is a
open,
widowmaker for ACs, you know. But now with the rehoused version of that,
ACs, yeah.
that's less of an issue now. But that was a function of that original housing with the K35. It was like a nightmare. Yeah.
I want this.
Tricky, but it could be done. It's just tricky.
I want this discussion to continue, and so I'm going to invite everybody to come to Burbank, California, where I know that we will continue stuff like this. This happens, and I guess we were out of time, so I wanted to thank everyone here, Linus, Oren, Chris. It's been amazing.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks for coming.